Welcome back for another deep dive. This time you guys sent in some really powerful excerpts all about altars and sacrifice, and especially how those ideas play out from a Christian perspective. I mean, this is some serious theological territory we're stepping into here.
It really is. The excerpts seem to be drawing a pretty direct line from the physical altars we see all over the Old Testament to the more spiritual ideas that pop up in the New Testament.
Okay, so let's back up for a second. For anyone who maybe hasn't spent as much time in the Old Testament, can you kind of paint a picture of what an altar actually represented back then?
Well, you got to remember, in ancient Israelite religion, an altar wasn't just like a random pile of rocks or something.
Right?
They were built like intentionally as a place of worship. The spot where sacrifices were made. It was like a bridge between humanity and God. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And it wasn't just a one-time thing either, right? Like altars keep showing up throughout the entire Old Testament.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. You've got Abraham building altars everywhere he goes, almost like marking these significant moments on his journey.
Right.
Then you have Moses up on Mount Sinai receiving the Ten Commandments. Some scholars actually believe that there might have been an altar involved there too.
Interesting.
And then, of course, you have like the ultimate example, right? Solomon's temple with that huge, magnificent central altar. Like I said, altars were woven into the fabric of their faith.
Okay, so you've got all this history, all this weight behind these physical altars. So how does the New Testament come in and, as you say, sort of shift things?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. In the New Testament, the whole concept of the altar takes on like a much more personal dimension.
Oh,
The idea starts emerging that it's actually the believer's body that becomes the temple of the Holy Spirit.
whoa. Okay, so instead of going to a specific place to worship, the idea now is that God actually dwells within us. That's a pretty massive shift in thinking, isn't it?
Totally. And it completely revolutionized how they understood worship and sacrifice. Think about it. In the Old Testament, you bring your offering, like an animal or crops, whatever, to this physical location, right?
Yeah.
But now, the offering is you. Your entire life becomes the act of worship.
Wow. That's powerful. And speaking of sacrifice, I mean, obviously that's another word that has a pretty different meaning in the Old Testament compared to the New, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So what was going on back then?
Well, in the Old Testament, when they talked about sacrifice, they were mainly talking about animal sacrifice. And it was all about atonement, like how you made things right with God when you messed up. And it's all laid out in crazy detail in Leviticus.
Right, yeah.
Like they tell you exactly what kind of animal you had to bring, all the steps involved in the ritual. It was a deeply ingrained practice.
Yeah, totally. But then, of course, you have Jesus entering the picture. So did his arrival, like, instantly do away with all those Old Testament practices?
Hmm. Well, it wasn't so much about instantly doing away with them as it was about reframing the whole idea of sacrifice. You see, the New Testament presents Jesus as like the ultimate sacrifice,
Okay.
the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world.
Right.
And what makes his sacrifice so unique is that it's a one-time thing,
Yeah.
complete, initiated by God himself.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something humans had to keep repeating over and over again.
Okay, that makes sense. But then that leaves us with a bit of a dilemma, doesn't it? If we're no longer sacrificing animals, then what does sacrifice even mean for us, for people living today? That seems like kind of a massive leap to make.
You know, it really is. It's about understanding that through Jesus' sacrifice, there's now a way for us to have this direct relationship with God.
Yeah.
The writer of Hebrews even goes so far as to say that the old sacrifices, they become obsolete because they could never really bridge that gap.
Right.
But we are still called to offer our lives as, get this, living sacrifices.
Living sacrifices.
Yeah, it's actually right there in Romans 12.1.
Huh. Okay, so let me see if I'm following them correctly. Instead of like physically offering up an animal on an altar, we're now being asked to offer up our entire lives, every part of ourselves in service to God. Our thoughts, actions, everything.
Precisely. It's a complete and total transformation. It's like, imagine if each one of us, we became a living altar, and our daily lives, those become the offering. It's a radical new way of looking at life, don't you think? Like if you think about those massive altars in the Old Testament, the ones built to last, out of stone and all carefully constructed.
Yeah.
What if we took that same approach to our lives? Building something that will last, something meaningful with the choices we make.
That's a powerful thought. I mean, it really is like we're constantly building this metaphorical altar with the bricks of our daily lives. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I like that image. I'm going to have to remember that one. But the source material you sent also talks a lot about idolatry and the dangers of that. So how does that fit into this whole idea of our bodies being temples?
That's actually a really important point. The excerpts you sent include these really strong warnings against idolatry, specifically from Exodus and Joshua. And God is crystal clear about it, like no worshiping idols, period. And it really boils down to this fundamental choice, you know, choosing who we serve, making sure that our altar, so to speak, is pointed towards the one true God and not something else.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. So if our body is the temple, what are some of the things we might be tempted to put on that altar instead of God in today's world, I mean?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's something that each of us, like individually, really needs to grapple with. Like, what are we putting first in our lives? Where does our ultimate allegiance lie? Is it our career, money, possessions, maybe even just our own selfish desires?
Right.
Anything that we put ahead of God that has the potential to become an idol in our lives.
I appreciate that you're emphasizing personal reflection here because it's so easy to get caught up in pointing fingers at what other people are doing, what they're worshiping. But taking a long, hard look at our own priorities, that's a lot tougher.
No, you're exactly right. And to be fair, this idea of idolatry isn't always about, like, literally bowing down to some golden statue. Like, think about ancient Rome, for example.
Okay.
That's where the book of Romans was written, right? Well, for the Romans, the idea of sacrifice that was already, like, deeply embedded in their culture.
Wait, really? So the Romans, they had their own version of sacrifice.
Oh, yeah, big time. They had all these elaborate rituals, these offerings to their gods, often involving animals and even in some cases, human sacrifice.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty intense. So knowing that, how do you think this idea of offering yourself as a living sacrifice, like it says in Romans 12.1, how would that have landed with a Roman audience?
I think it would have been absolutely revolutionary, like mind-blowing. See, in Roman society, sacrifice was almost always about appeasing the gods to get something back in return,
Mm-hmm.
like good harvests or victory in battle, stuff like that. It was a transaction. But Paul in Romans, he's talking about something completely different. He's calling for complete and utter surrender. This idea of offering your life as an act of love and devotion, not as some kind of bargaining chip.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It really flips the script on what sacrifice even means.
It's not just about what you're sacrificing, it's about why. It all comes back to the heart.
Okay, so let's go back to that image of building that metaphorical altar with our lives. What are some of the building blocks that we should be using? Like what are the good materials?
Well, the excerpts actually give us some really, really solid starting points. I mean, first and foremost, it's about recognizing that ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, right? That's like the bedrock, the foundation that everything else is built upon.
Yeah, that makes sense because without Christ's sacrifice, there's really no way for us to even offer our lives as an acceptable sacrifice to God, right?
Exactly. It's through his sacrifice that we are made clean, we're made worthy to even come before God in the first place.
Right.
And once we understand that, then we can start building on that foundation. And the way we do that is with actions that reflect his love, his grace.
So like living a life of integrity, being kind to others, generosity, those sorts of things.
Exactly. Like, think about the fruit of the Spirit, the qualities that are listed in Galatians, right?
Okay.
Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are the building blocks, the materials we use to build our altar.
That's good. I like that. But the excerpts also talk about, actively resisting temptation and choosing to turn away from sin. So it's not just about, doing good things. It's about rejecting the bad stuff too, right?
Oh, yeah. That's huge. And those verses about rejecting idolatry, the ones from Exodus and Joshua,
Mm-hmm.
those are so relevant here because we have to constantly be asking ourselves, are my actions lining up with what God wants? Are they bringing him glory, or am I letting myself get pulled away from him?
It's like we're constantly checking the foundation of our altar, making sure it's solid, that there aren't any cracks.
Yeah, exactly. And being willing to rebuild when we need to. It's this lifelong process of examining ourselves, making changes, and just striving to become more like Christ,
I gotta say, this whole conversation has really shifted my perspective. I mean, it's just so easy to get bogged down in the day-to-day stuff and forget about, the bigger picture, that our lives really are an offering.
Oh, yeah, I think we all struggle with that. And that's exactly why we need to keep these concepts front and center.
Yeah.
To remember, we are temples, our lives are the offering. And every single choice we make It all plays a part in building that altar.
Every choice contributes to the altar. I like the way you put that. This isn't just about the big things, those grand gestures or some extraordinary act of service. This is about everyday life.
That's the beauty of it. It's about recognizing that even the littlest things, they can be these powerful offerings. It's about bringing that same level of dedication and intentionality to everything we do, like making every moment count for something eternal.
It's funny you say that. That reminds me of that verse in First Corinthians where Paul talks about doing everything, like everything, as unto the Lord, like acknowledging that God is present in every aspect of our lives.
Perfect example. Whether we're eating, drinking, working, playing, it all should be done for God's glory, right?
Right?
Our lives, they become like this seamless tapestry of worship, not just something that's, confined to certain moments in a church building.
Yeah, this really challenges that whole idea that, like, we have our spiritual lives and then we have our secular lives, as if they're two separate things.
Golden.
It's about living a life of wholeness.
It's about our actions lining up with our beliefs, right? Like letting our inner world, what's going on inside, letting that be reflected in how we act, how we behave.
Mhm.
If we're truly offering our lives as a sacrifice, it's going to be evident in how we treat other people, how we handle those tough situations, even how we approach those everyday mundane tasks.
You know what? I'm starting to see that this whole altar metaphor, it's not just about a place of worship.
Yeah.
It's really more like this symbol of our commitment to God, like a testament to how he's working in our lives, how he's changing us.
And remember, it's a work in progress, always. We're all still learning, growing, trying to become the people that God created us to be.
Right.
It's a humbling process, but also incredibly freeing.
Yeah, I like that. It's like even in our mess ups, even when we're not perfect, we can still offer ourselves to God, knowing that he accepts us as we are.
That's grace for you. It meets us right where we're at, and it gives us the strength to keep moving forward. Even when we stumble, even when we fall short, we can always come back to the altar, offer ourselves again, and experience the power of his love to change us.
This whole conversation about our lives being a living sacrifice has been really thought-provoking, but I gotta admit, it's still a little abstract for me. Like, do you think maybe looking at some actual examples from the Bible, some real stories, might help make this whole thing a bit more tangible? You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And the excerpts you send in, they actually highlight some great ones, like Abraham, Moses, Solomon. Their stories, they can give us a much deeper understanding of what it really meant to approach God with a heart of sacrifice, that true devotion.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's start with Abraham. I mean, his story is just full of those moments where God calls him to like step out in faith and just obey, even when it makes absolutely no sense.
Right. And I think there's maybe no moment more dramatic than when God asks him to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. I mean, talk about the ultimate test of faith, right? That we're
Yeah.
willing to surrender absolutely everything to God.
It's hard to even imagine what must have been going through his mind at that point.
I know. And yet, if you look at the text, it says that Abraham, he obeyed, no questions asked. He built an altar, prepared the wood, bound Isaac, and was about to raise the knife.
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty intense scene, but it just shows you the depth of his trust in God.
It's amazing. But of course, the story doesn't end there. God steps in at the very last second and provides a ram to be sacrificed instead of Isaac. And, looking back, that becomes this powerful foreshadowing of God's own sacrifice, sending his son Jesus to die for humanity.
Exactly. It's like even way back in the Old Testament, the whole idea of sacrifice, it was pointing to something much bigger, something more complete. It's almost like Abraham's willingness to offer up Isaac. It becomes kind of an altar in itself, a symbol of that total surrender, that complete devotion.
I like that. Okay, so moving on. The source material also mentions Moses building an altar at the foot of Mount Sinai. What was it about that specific moment that made it so significant?
Well, for the Israelites, that marked a pivotal moment in their history
Okay.
because that's where God established his covenant with them. He gave them the Ten Commandments, set them apart as his chosen people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that altar, it became like this physical representation of their agreement with God.
So it's more than just a place to offer up sacrifices. It's more like a symbol of their whole relationship with God, right? A tangible reminder of their commitment to him.
Absolutely. It became this central point for their worship, this visual representation of who they were as a people, as God's people. It's almost like that altar, it held their entire history and also, all their hopes for the future as a nation.
Wow, that's amazing. And of course, the source also mentions Solomon's temple. I mean, that's the one that everyone knows about, right? Famous for being so grand, so elaborate, and of course, that magnificent altar that stood right in the middle of it all.
Oh, yeah. Solomon's temple was like the pinnacle of Israelite religious practice, their architecture, everything. It was specifically designed to be awe-inspiring, a place where they believed that God's presence, it dwelled in this unique, powerful way.
And within the temple, the altar was the most sacred spot, right?
Absolutely. That's where they offered the sacrifices, where the incense was constantly burning, and where they believed God's glory would descend. Can you imagine, like, the feeling, the sense of awe and reverence people must have felt when they approached that altar?
I can only imagine. So really, it represents like the culmination of centuries of Israelite religious tradition. It's like the physical embodiment of their devotion to God.
It really is. But it's also important to keep in mind that even Solomon's temple, as amazing as it was eventually destroyed, you know?
Oh, right. Yeah.
The Babylonians came in and tore the whole thing down in 586 BC. And that really marked a turning point for Israel.
And, thinking about it, that destruction, in a way, it paves the way for that New Testament transition we were talking about earlier, doesn't it? Like, it foreshadows that whole shift from a physical temple to the believer's body becoming the new dwelling place for God.
You got it. It really highlights the fact that true worship, it's not about a specific building or a certain time of day, right?
Right.
It's about this inner transformation that happens. It's about a heart that's aligned with God's will. And that's not something that any army can ever destroy.
That's a good point. It's incredible how these Old Testament stories, even though they're all focused on these physical altars and sacrifices, they ultimately point to a deeper, more spiritual understanding of what it means to worship.
I think so too. And they really challenge us to think about how we're offering up our own lives as those living sacrifices in today's world. Like, how are we building that altar with the choices we make every single day? How are we making our lives a testament to God's love and his grace?
Those are good questions. Questions that, we can keep wrestling with long after this deep dive is over. This has been an amazing journey exploring how this whole idea of altars and sacrifice has evolved over time and how those ancient concepts, they still have so much to say to us today.
I agree. And just remember, you don't need stones and mortar to build an altar that will last. All you need is a willing heart, a commitment to following God, and the courage to make every moment count for something eternal.